A very good morning and a very warm welcome to you all to this webinar on trade prospects in the next 5 years. I'm A.K. Bhattacharya, and I used to be the editor of Business Standard, and I'm now associated with it as its editorial director. This webinar is an initiative of the Ananta Aspen Center, which has been holding a series of such events. In the light of COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the world order, the idea is to reach out to a larger society and bring it up to date on the complex, diverse, and evolving international environment, and to assess how that is impacting India in a post-COVID world. I'm pleased to say that we have here with us 3 eminent experts and friends of Ananta Aspen Center taking part in today's discussion. Let me welcome and introduce them as well. Mr. Suresh Prabhu has held various cabinet portfolios and is known for his out-of-the-box thinking. He has ushered in many reforms and brought about organizational transformations. At present, he is the official emissary of the Prime Minister of India in the G7 and G20 forums, and is responsible for preparing the official agenda of the Government of India on key issues. Most importantly, for today's discussion, Mr. Prabhu held the ministerial portfolio for trade in the Narendra Modi government. Welcome to this webinar, Mr. Prabhu.
Thank you.
Yeah. Our second speaker is Dr. NAUSHAD Forbes. Dr. Forbes is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. He's also an academic, having served as a visiting professor at Stanford, where he developed courses on technology in newly industrializing countries. He is a past president of the Confederation of Indian Industry and a well-read and well-respected columnist. Welcome, Dr. Forbes.
Thank you. Good to be here. You should have said columnist in Business Standard.
Well, I don't want to promote my own newspaper. Dr. Mohan Kumar, our third speaker, is at present the chairman at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, or RIS, a think tank with a career in the Indian Foreign Service for about 36 years behind him. Ambassador Kumar also teaches at the Jindal School of International Affairs and is the Vice Dean and Professor of Diplomatic Practice. He was India's ambassador to France and was also India's lead negotiator, first at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and then at the World Trade Organization, in crucial areas such as intellectual property rights, services, dispute settlement, rules, and technical barriers to trade. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you.
Today's topic, we can jump into straight, is extremely important. Let me give you a brief background, and that relates to India's performance on the goods trade front. And it has not been very good in the last few years. As a share in India's GDP, our merchandise exports actually have declined from 15% in 2014-15, as per GDP, to 10% of GDP in 2019-20. Imports too have fallen from 23% of GDP to about 15% in the same period. But that is not a big comfort. Actually, it points to other deeper problems in the domestic economy. COVID-19 will make the task of reviving our trade even more challenging. Our March exports actually fell by 34% without the full impact of the COVID lockdown. There are estimates that suggest that world trade could contract by anything between 13 and 32% in 2020. Where do we stand in this gloomy scenario? I'll just point out 3 worrying trends to start off and then go over to experts. One, India's service exports, which was a big support to our overall trade account have seen a deceleration. They grew by just 4% last year. The second point I would make is a softening international crude oil prices have not been a big bonanza. As even as crude oil prices have fallen, our exports have taken a hit as well. Today, our petroleum products constitute the second biggest item of our exports. And three, in a world where World Trade Organization is becoming weaker and almost irrelevant, our engagement with other emerging trading blocs has not been very fruitful so far. So the scenario for our trade in the next 5 years is full of challenges, and we have an excellent panel here to discuss them. I would request our experts to speak for about 5 minutes to give their initial comments on how they view these challenges. And then we move to a brief question answer session before taking questions from our audience. Let me begin with you, Mr. Prabhu, first. Your initial thoughts on the issues that we are confronted with.
Thank you, Ananta Center, as well as my dear friends, all three of them I can see on the screen are very dear, long-time friends, also respected friends. So I'm very happy and honored to be part of this very enlightened group of people who will be talking about the issues. I think we can look at these trade issues from three perspectives. One, a conceptual issue, which gives us historical background. The countries are immensely benefited when they were part of a global value chain. That is a recent origin, something like a value chain. But those economies which have been open economies have benefited immensely for their domestic population. That's a historical perspective. Very interestingly, a country like Argentina used to be the darling of investors in mid-20s and 30s, suffered when they decided to put barriers on their border and prevented free trade as they were doing before. So that's the conceptual historical. There are many evidences as late as China becoming from nothing to second largest economy of the world with almost $14.185 trillion of global GDP, part of the GDP. So this proves this is one conceptual issue. So is ASEAN economies called Asian tigers, before that Japanese and Korean economies. So these are all many examples of that, how countries are benefited. Other two, we should look at it from India's perspective. And this gives us a conceptual clarity about how it should be done from two. One, you are asking me about 5 years. There are certain events which will be at the receiving end, which might happen globally. Because we talk about global trade, so obviously how the global economy will perform will have an impact on India. And now it is more or less everybody agrees that global economy will be in a downturn. There will be huge contraction, and particularly those major two economies, the European Union economy and the US economy, will certainly contract at an unprecedented level. And that is going to happen and coincide with the fact that their public debt to GDP ratio will be very high. So that means they will be struggling to service and grapple with a huge challenge of public debt in the next few years' time. I will not say necessarily 5 years, but definitely more than 2-3 years for sure. And at a time when this is happening globally, there have been a global trend we are witnessing that particularly the developed world is trying to use a lot of barriers. US is a good example. They wanted to renegotiate their trade deals with almost all of their major trading partners. And the trade war with China is still an ongoing affair. So we will have a huge global headwind to trade, which we witnessed from 2008 onwards. The trade contracted at a level higher than the global GDP. The global GDP was not, before 2008, was expanding at a much higher rate than the global trade. So that's the global thing. And from India's perspective, purely from domestic perspective, I think we stand to gain more if we have open economy. Why? Because if you want FDI, which now everybody is saying we want the industries from China to shift to India. That has to happen. Obviously, there's a direct linkage between trade and investment. There is proved beyond doubt that FDI will not come if there is only one-way traffic of inviting investment, but you cannot go out. Yesterday only, I don't watch TV, but somebody was saying they watched on Mahabharat Abhimanyu, wherein Abhimanyu could come in but couldn't come out of the Chakravyuha. So I don't think FDI can come if there is no outward opening for them in many areas. And as I said, there is a empirical evidence about trade and investment. The second issue for India is, whether we like it or not, we have not benefited as much from open trade as much as China benefited. Incidentally, China joined WTO much later, but we were the founding of GATT. That's because of our domestic constraints, which did not allow us to reap the full benefit of we being part of a global trading system. Today, it's a time for India to reap that benefit. We opened our economy, our manufactured goods, merchandise, etc. Today, if we work aggressively and say that we want India to play a bigger role into the global trading system, we could benefit because, for example, and you very correctly pointed out, a very good example is petroleum, wherein we don't realize it, but our refining capacity in India helps us to export more than what we consume in terms of refined products, though we actually import crude in a significant way. So therefore, having opened previously and not benefited from it as much as we could have, it's a time to benefit now. So at a second wave, it's not necessarily second, but I'm saying the next wave should happen in such a way that India should benefit from it. I will just remind you of very interesting remarks our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi made in 2018 January in Davos, and I was there, so I was listening to him. And he said, we want open global economy to take benefit of the emerging opportunities. India has a huge opportunity for global value chain and supply chain. That's why we want them to shift to India. But supply chain, by definition, only part of the value chain or value addition happens in your country. It may be significant, but still it is part. And therefore, if you are not part of the global value chain, how will you benefit from it? And therefore, I think the trade and investment, trade and employment, you want to create more jobs, then obviously trade will play a significant role in that. Trade and your impact on global geopolitics is also very significant. And therefore, I think we should try to work on that. Again, I will give two examples. One, we organized, and under my chairmanship, we organized two mini ministerial in India. One was in 2018, one was in 2019, which was attended by largest number of countries for a mini ministerial. There were 57 which participated in one. Then second, of course, was only for the developing countries. Why? Because we realized that we must take advantage of it. I had set up a group in my ministry as Commerce Minister under chairmanship of Surjit Bhalla, who is now India's ED at IMF. in which the today's External Affairs Minister Jaishankar was a member, in which even Chandrajit Banerjee from CI was a member, and many others were members, to actually draw up a strategy as to how should we benefit from this emerging scenario. Mr. Adil Zainul is also a member. A lot of top class people were members. And that report is ready, which was actually discussed. So I think we have a roadmap to make that happen. Again, I'm saying you should not do anything blindly. Protect our own interest. Nobody can ever argue that we should be always at the receiving end, and we should be always constantly be taking the losing side. No, we should be a winner. And to be a winner, to create jobs for my people, to create more opportunities for small and medium enterprises, to be creating large Indian companies will have influence on global scale, wherein they'll be able to attract money at a cheaper rate. That increases competitiveness of India. That increases our footprint on global scale. All of that can happen. So therefore, protect my India's interest. All of this, what I'm saying, should be primarily driven by only one single motive. How do I promote my country? So we talk about New India at a time when there's a new world going to emerge. New world from the impact of COVID. So therefore, how do we benefit from it from trade perspective, we have to see. And in a way, the trade is very, very important part of your economy. So when India would be, I'm sure it would be, though COVID will delay it, $5 trillion economy. And as we feel that we should be, at least 50% of that should come from global trade. That includes both import and export. So therefore, we have to look at it from that perspective. If you want to position India on a different platter altogether, where we can remove poverty, whether we can address all the challenges that we face today, I think we should be thinking about a strategy which will be a bigger strategy, of which trade will be a very good component of it. I think you gave me a time limit, so I stop here. But I'm really happy that we are discussing the issue. And as I said again, the only foreign policy, only our trade policy, all our policies should be driven with a fundamental overriding consideration as to how we can make India a far better country than what it is today. And this is something which can happen if we have an integrated policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prabhu, for these opening remarks. I think you touched upon very, very key important issues. You talked about the importance of an open economy. You also recognize the fact that India should do a little more in taking the full advantage of a multilateral trading framework. But at the same time, India must protect its own interest, and COVID-19 will pose new challenges, and they must be taken head on. So I think, we have our next speaker, Dr. Forbes, and I would urge that he can take these issues forward with his initial thoughts. Dr. Forbes.
Thank you, Ashok, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. It's always a pleasure to share a dais with Mr. Suresh Prabhu. I think regardless of which portfolio he's held in various governments, he's always provided thought leadership in a new direction, whether it was in power, whether it was in railways, whether it was in industry and commerce. Mohan, it's a pleasure to share the dais with you as well. I think your time as our ambassador, not just in Paris, but at the WTO, was a time when we were most engaged with the world and really increasing our engagement in trade, using trade as a way of engaging very widely. And Ashok, as I've said repeatedly, not only do you provide great insight on questions, but you provide all the data that one could possibly need. You have all the numbers at the top of your head, as you indicated in your opening remarks. Let me divide my comments into 3 points: a sort of pre-COVID, COVID, and post-COVID period. Pre-COVID, just a few comments that coming into COVID, I think it's good to be clear of where we were as a country. Essentially from 1991 to around the mid 2010s, so say to around 2014-15, we were increasingly integrated with the world, right through to around 2017. Every year we saw a reduction in tariffs. Every year saw us more and more integrated with the world. Since 2017, in the last few years, even before COVID, I think we saw a reversal in our trade strategy. Certainly in our orientation, we became somewhat more inward looking. And I think we adopted this idea, which Suresh referred to as well, that somehow exports are good, but imports are bad. And this mindset that imports are bad and that one can somehow only be an exporter without being an importer, as Suresh very eloquently pointed out, is wrong. Milton Friedman said over 50 years ago that societies can't eat exports, they can eat imports. Societies actually benefit, human welfare is benefited in a country by imports, actually. And it's only the produced people involved in the production of exports that benefit in the production in exports. So the first thing I think is to be clear where we were as a country coming into COVID. COVID has only, I think, expanded this retreat into insularity, and I think it's done that all around the world. And it's sort of natural that when there's this strong external threat, when we're fearful, we tend to retreat more and more into our own domain and try to protect ourselves and our health and our families and our livelihoods as best we can. And this is true in every country. It's true in and we see it in shutting off borders to trade and to even travel these days. We see it in shutting off borders even for interstate movement of goods and people. We see it in cities sort of walling themselves off, and we see it then in our own homes as we try to restrict access. But I think all of this is temporary. All of this is driven by the fear and the current circumstances of dealing with this health challenge and this health crisis. As things become more normal, I think we'll see that entire trend of insularity reverse. And I hope that reversal extends right through to trade internationally and to international travel and to our increasing engagement with the world. I think we'll see just as the tide has come in, we'll see the tide move out again, and we'll see that trend reverse. And we'll be supported in that move by one very important benefit that we're getting from COVID, which is the fall in the rupee. The rupee has actually depreciated by almost 10% since the start of this calendar year. That's a great benefit. It makes Indian exports more competitive. It makes imports more expensive. That's a very good way in which we've seen actually competitiveness improve, if you like, by 10% in just these last 5 months. So let me last then talk about beyond COVID. I think there is a huge opportunity for India. I fully agree and I'm fully aligned with Suresh on this point. I think he's exactly right that there's a huge opportunity for us as a country going forward. So far, it's just anecdotal evidence, but I have friends. I was just making a list as he was speaking. I have a friend who runs an FMCG company, a friend who runs a specialty chemical company, a friend who runs a food processing company, and someone who runs a rubber products company. So 4 very different sectors. All 4 of them in the last 2 or 3 weeks have been receiving inquiries from companies in Europe, in Japan, in the US, saying, we want to diversify our sourcing away from China. Can you help us? How can you provide us with the right quality and competitive competitive output such that we can source from India and source from you instead of sourcing as we do today only from China. So there's a real opportunity that is sitting there waiting for us, and we need to take that opportunity. I think this will require two changes. It will require a change in our policies. We need to be more outward looking in our trade negotiations. We need to be more outward looking, for example, in RCEP, to re-engage with the RCEP process, because that's a very vibrant, it's the most vibrant economic area of the world, and we need to become a part of the Asia trading opportunity. We need to engage again with the EU in negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU. Today, a garment factory in Bangladesh can export, an Indian company setting up a factory in Bangladesh can export garments to the EU at a 10% lower tariff than would be imposed from India. And in a competitive industry like garments, that 10% makes the difference between production happening at home or production happening in Bangladesh. So there are great opportunities which we need to grab. We need to have this outward looking orientation in our trade policy. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to the stance of industry and how industry sees the world. If industry sees the world in positive terms, if industry sees the world as an opportunity instead of a threat, and if we start investing as companies in new markets, in a presence overseas, in manufacturing overseas as well, but especially in establishing our own sales networks and our market opportunities overseas, then I think we will indeed tap this opportunity that we have today as a country.
Good, thank you very much. I think you sort of, outlined many of the challenges that we have to meet if we have to follow the model that has been put forward by Mr. Prabhu. So I think, in a sense of getting an overall broad sense of the issues that we need to tackle and the manner in which we need to tackle those issues are becoming clearer for us. Now, in this background, let me move to Dr. Mohan Kumar, who probably is in the best position to provide us an international perspective on what are those trade challenges that lie ahead of the country. Dr. Kumar.
Thank you very much, AKB, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege actually to be sharing the stage with such distinguished people, Honorable Suresh Prabhu, Mr. NAUSHAD, Forbes, and you yourself. In the next 5 minutes, as you rightly said, let me address the principal challenges that India's trade policy will face. So the first proposition that I want to make is that MFN-based, WTO-anchored international trade is certainly drawing to a close. So I'm not saying the WTO will disappear, but what I'm saying is India's dependence on MFN-based and WTO-anchored international trade was already, stopping even at the time of President Obama. It has accelerated under President Trump. And my sense is post-COVID, most international trade will be preferential. It will not be MFN-based. In as much as India has depended heavily in the past on MFN trade, and I will come to it in a little while, I think this is the first challenge that is posed for Indian trade. That's the first. The second thing is that as both Mr. Suresh Prabhu and Mr. NAUSHAD Forbes hinted, there is an opportunity, but there is also a problem vis-a-vis China and so on. So trade will also be more strategic than ever before. So it is not just pure economic criteria that are going to drive trade, and we need to be conscious of this. If this premise is correct, if these two propositions are correct, then I think status quo in India's trade policy is not an option. I do not believe our current trade policy will suffice. We will have to make some changes that have been hinted at by both the previous illustrious speakers. Coming to value chains, there is a inherent link between trade and value chains. And there are two ways of going about it. One is the China way, if you like, inherently competitive and the factory of the world, the manufacturing center of the world. And therefore, value chains chose China to some extent. But there is a second method. And the second method is how you can use FTAs to get on to value chains. To some extent, our experience of an FTA with ASEAN, an FTA with Japan, and FTA with Korea. We have the irony is all our FTAs are located in the East. We have nothing to the West, and I'm coming to that in a little while. You have value chains to the East. You have it with ASEAN, you have it with Malaysia, you have it with Singapore, you have it with Korea. So you have enough value chains. And at this point, I do not believe anyone will suggest you must embark on an FTA with China for obvious reasons. There's so much stronger, there's so much, of an export that you are importing more from China. So I'm not sure that will work. So it is really the FTA policy of the government of India that I want to focus on for a minute, if you like, because that is really the nub of the matter, frankly, because you are not going to be able to depend on MFN. As Mr. NAUSHAD Forbes rightly said, Indian investors are fleeing to Bangladesh. I never thought I'll say this, but that's a fact. Because from Bangladesh, in some markets, you can actually export at 0% because Bangladesh is an LDC. So actually, you can export garments from Bangladesh to EU at 0%. Pakistan has GSP plus, and India has GSP. So you can imagine the disadvantage faced by India. So I would say that if it is FTAs that you want to talk about, you cannot but have an FTA with two key economies in the world, US and EU, whichever way you look at it. The top 5 economies are US, EU, Japan, China. We already have an FTA with Japan. So that's covered. We have an FTA with ASEAN, covered. We have an FTA with Korea. We do not have an FTA with the two major economies of the world. Also, the two major export markets for India. So I agree with Mr. Forbes that all imports should not be considered bad. And that is not the way of assessing the FTAs that we did in the East. Even so, it is well recognized that if you want your economy to grow and you want to become a 5 trillion economy and so on, your exports have to double. If your exports have to double, the strategic decision that India has to make, where are those export markets? I argue, and obviously I speak under correction. I'm not saying I'm true or I'm entirely right. I would say the bulk of the growth in exports in the next 5 years is going to be to the west of India for India. That is the real argument I'm making, AKB. Okay. I'm not saying I'm necessarily entirely right, but I suggest for consideration, therefore, that you have to focus on US and EU. If you have to focus on US and EU, you have models in front of you. With regard to EU, in October 2019, EU signed an FTA with Vietnam. As Mr. Forbes and Mr. Prabhu were saying earlier, India should have been the first emerging country to sign with EU. I deeply regret that we were this close to signing an FTA with EU 5-6 years ago, and both sides failed to clinch it. It's distinctly unfortunate in my humble view. We should have done it. Anyway, better late than never. Vietnam is the first developing country, major country to have this FTA with EU. You take a look at the EU-Vietnam FTA. 90% of your tariff lines have to be liberalized in 10 years. You need to open up public procurement. You need to adopt higher intellectual property rights standards. And you need to accept e-commerce, which believes in free flow of data. The question I pose, is India ready for this? Because this is the real question, frankly. If you want to have an FTA with EU, EU is not going to lower the standards for India. I mean, arguably, India is a much bigger market than Vietnam. So there will be some concessions that EU might make, but not a whole lot. So we need to be able to adopt to higher standards, which are already staring you in the face in the case of EU-Vietnam FTA. With regard to United States, I think we're a long way from FTA, but we have to seal that bilateral trade deal. That's been hanging fire for too long, frankly. And this bilateral trade deal, again, you have a model in the form of the China trade deal that they have signed, the initial phase, and the initial phase that United States signed with Japan. Again, IPRs is something that we have to look at, intellectual property rights. We need to look at labor environmental standards. If you allow me, and since I no longer belong to the government as such, and being the head of a think tank gives me a little bit of license to think aloud, in both labor and environment, I suggest for consideration that India adopt higher standards because it is in our own interest. There has been a huge debate in India that migrant labor deserves better pay, better standards, better working conditions. If that is the case, I put it to you, AKB, why is India scared of labor standards? We have signed all the conventions of ILO. Why don't we accept these labor standards in our own interest? Again, environmental standards. Everybody now knows that Delhi has blue skies, and we have it because of you know what. So why don't we accept some of these standards in our own interest rather than interpret it as somebody issuing a diktat so that you have to accept it? I think that is the mindset change that we need to do. But I'm going to conclude because of want of time to say the following two concluding points. International trade for the foreseeable future will be non-MFN. It will be based on managed trade, voluntary export restraints, and tariff rate quotas. I can explain this in the question and answer session if some of them are interested. All these are instruments of managed trade. The era of free trade is over. Second, trade will become fragmented. International trade will be highly fragmented and will become subject to more and more geostrategic criteria. We will have to make sure, India, that we are on the right side of this phenomenon. Once again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar, for, I think you laid the ground for a really animated question answer session after this. And meanwhile, let me say that we have got lots of people who have joined us already. And my request to them is not to wait for the Q&A session, but instead start sending those questions to us so that we can, as soon as we are through with the initial round of questions and answers from our panelists, we can pick those questions up and get them answered. So this is a request to all our participants who have joined us for this webinar to don't wait for the session to this session to conclude, but send questions so that we can take it up later. Mr. Prabhu, a couple of questions that have arisen after your initial comments and then Dr. Forbes' intervention and Dr. Kumar's suggestions. How would you respond to them? In the sense that you rightly pointed out that India has not fully benefited from the WTO system. Dr. Forbes pointed out that we have probably moved in a different direction as far as trade liberalization is concerned, in terms of we have become a little more protective. And Dr. Kumar says that this is a completely new world that we're entering, where the MFN-based approach to trade is going to disappear. And trade will not only be managed, is an excellent expression, it will be managed. We have heard of managed democracies, but this is managed trade, and with trade will be fragmented. So with your vast experience in governance, and also as a person who has held two fairly successful interministerial meetings on WTO, what would you see the way forward, and how do you see trade moving forward in the next 5 years, given the inputs that our other co-panelists have put forward? Dr. Prabhu.
Firstly, I think looking east itself was a very strategic decision taken under Prime Minister Narendra Rao. And so the FTAs that followed are also in continuation of that. Then the Prime Minister, Modi, took a very dynamic shift in saying not just look east, but act east. And in any case, if you look at the global output estimation in the next few years' time, not necessarily 5 years, of course, because 5 years is, now today everything has changed so much that post-COVID we have to recalculate and recalibrate our many ideas. But even then, the major economic activity which will contribute significantly to global output will happen in Asia. And in Asia, it is actually east of India more, not necessarily the west of India. But I fully agree with Ambassador version of EU. I'll just tell you briefly what happened 2013. After 16 rounds with EU, we could not conclude an FTA. After 16 rounds in 2013. So I, as a commerce minister, I called up the then trade commissioner is the trade minister of the European Union, a former member of parliament from Sweden who used to be my very good friend and colleague, Cecilia. And I told her, why not start again? And I took a lot of pains to actually restart the work with them. It was EU which has to come back. And whenever I used to meet EU members, whether they're prime minister or the presidents or their trade ministers, they all agreed individually that we must do it, but as a collective body, they could not agree on certain issues. And particularly the point he was trying to make is related to, there are so many other considerations that goes into the trade agreement, particularly the EU members, because of the value system, the labor laws, the human rights, the environmental issues, etc., which are very important, and I fully agree, but they could have been considered not necessarily along with trade, but on a standalone basis, which are so important. Anyway, that's one point. Now, if you really look at it, where is going to be the next growth coming in? I agree. For the next 5 years, because we are talking about a very limited time span, I think next 5 years, there won't be much of a growth in European Union because of their domestic compulsions. US depends upon the next presidential election, which will happen in November. What's going to be the new administration? With the administration is going to continue with the same thinking of very aggressive trade policies. We'll have very difficult times to discuss about the trade. But if you have a new administration which will think differently, there may be a different scenario. We are missing out a very important market, and that's Africa. Africa with 54, 55 countries, because it depends upon which, the 55th country, whether you add or not, but 54. We have a same size of population, those 54 countries. And there, the base is low, the volume will not be large. And I fully agree with Ambassador when he said, the biggest economy is US, then EU as a whole. China, number 2 as a country, but EU is very significant. And so this is one. And then Latin America. In my opinion, we should do that. In fact, then 1999, 21 years ago, I had encouraged India's industrialists to go and sell medicines into Latin America, which has paid huge dividend today. That time it was unheard market, untapped market, and today it has become major market. So we can work on that. But on the MFN, I fully agree. In fact, I fully agree that trade is going to be very strategic, whether we like it or not. In fact, just imagine when we are talking about moving, those companies were talking about moving away from China, it is not necessarily a commercial decision. It's a strategic decision. They want to take, and they may be probably be encouraged by their own governments to do that. I don't know. I'm just saying, but strategic. So trade has always been strategic, actually. In fact, India became part of British Empire because of trade, actually, because they first came British East Indian Company, and then so that was a strategic decision. So trade is always been strategic, any case. But tomorrow the trade will become even more strategic. Why? Because, and this is the point I've been making for the last almost 30 years. In fact, NAUSHAD and you both, we have been part of the Track to Strategic Dialogue with US and the same Ananta Center. And I've been saying this for the last 20, 25 years to US friends that do trade with India, make investments in India. We are not going to put to you a strategic challenge by the economic power that will accumulate out of it. So we will have a great advantage if we focus on that. And therefore, what I'm saying, which both NAUSHAD and Ambassador mentioned, we must now build up a proper domestic structure. You cannot take advantage, and the reason why we could not take advantage of WTO despite the fact that we have been member of GATT from 1948 is because of domestic constraints. So I think now we'll have to prepare to take advantage of it in a way that we actually rebuild our domestic policies as well. See, there is a trade is an extension of domestic policy. So global trade policy that we like to adopt and strategy to take advantage of a very favorable economic and trade opportunities for India, very favorable. From strategic perspective, from commercial perspective, from economic perspective, all of that. But for that, we'll have to gear up and do that. And that is why actually you'll be surprised. The group that had set up under the chairmanship of Sujit Bhalla was actually for this, and this was before COVID. I set it up more than almost 1.5, 2 years ago, when I was saying that there's opportunities to come from China to India. At that time, there was no COVID. But I realized at that time itself that there is going to be huge opportunities. Therefore, I said I will bring together a lot of experts from different fields. They made certain very strong recommendations, which of course, sometimes some strong recommendations are difficult to accept, but as Ambassador was saying about raising certain standards in India, we become contentious but necessary for long-term benefit. So I think we should try to work on that. The second point, what he mentioned is, so I give you a perspective about FTA with US and both EU. And I think this MFN type of trade, but of course, when you have FTA, you become MFN. Anyway, you can actually deal with that. So I think it is not necessarily that, but what he was trying to make was that you cannot just based on certain, please, help me that kind of a thing. It has to be strength and based on our intrinsic abilities to take advantage of it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Prabhu. Let me turn to Dr. Forbes. View from the discussion so far that we have to give a fillip to investments if you want to get into trade. You also talked about how the exchange rate policy has come to our rescue in a sense that the rupee is appreciated, so probably that's an opportunity. If we indeed have to take full advantage of the new scenario, from your vantage point as somebody who is overseeing an industry, what are the key things, key policy changes that you need to be implemented within a given time frame as early as possible to help India become a better trading nation in this environment, whereas Dr. Kumar and Mr. Prabhu and others are all saying that the terms of trade have changed. In a sense, it's no longer going to be MFN-based trade, it will be strategic trade or managed trade. So that's one question. And one supplementary to that would be, that we often keep talking about that rupee depreciation is not enough. You need some factor market reforms. And we have seen some labor law changes in a very ad hoc fashion by some state governments. It would be good to know from you what's your perspective on both these issues, Dr. Forbes.
So, first, just a comment on the points about managed trade. I appreciate where that's coming from. I have to say I worry about it because, and I worry especially that in a world with an increased quantum of managed trade, I think that's a world where we in India are at a disadvantage. I think we're actually at an advantage in a world where there are more transparent rules. One works for a level playing field, and one leaves it to individual initiative in the market to decide what trade happens. I think a world of that kind is one that we benefit from much more because the strength of India, the Indian economy rests in its private sector. The strength in the Indian economy rests in our domestic entrepreneurship. And I think all of that is what will determine success. And so we should keep working actually as a country for transparent, equal rules with everyone and avoid managed trade to the extent that we can as a way of bringing about trading relationships between countries. So we should keep working on access to countries and then leave it to firms in the two countries to trade and make markets happen. In terms of what policies will really help, first I think firms have to be forced to compete. Industry generally does not ask for lower tariffs. Industry wants protection by and large. And I think it's for government to hear industry, understand industry's concerns, but where needed, turn a deaf ear to them. And I say this as an industrialist, because I think the national interest, which is the role that a policymaker has to play, comes ahead of any individual firm's interest. And the national interest comes from having really competitive firms. And competitiveness will show in being able to compete in world markets, and will show in being able to sell at home good quality products that one's own consumers wish to buy. So I think forcing firms to compete is the important policy stance that should be constantly adopted. Because if you force firms to compete, they have no choice, they will compete. Now, are there areas where we operate with a disadvantage? Yes. Are there areas where cost structures are too high and where we need domestic reforms? Exactly what Mohan was talking about earlier on, such that we can reduce those costs? Absolutely, we should. And we should use trade, if you like, and use the threat of free trade as a way of bringing about those domestic reforms so that we can compete in a level manner. So if our logistics costs are too high, or our power costs are too high, or whatever, or there are cross subsidies for power which make a particular industrial sector uncompetitive, then use free trade, use imports as a way of actually addressing and forcing the addressing of those domestic policy issues too. It's in our interest to do so. The last point that you raised about the labor reforms, I think without question, we can be a successful trading nation as we have been without being active in labor-intensive products. But it's in our interest to be active in labor-intensive products, because that's how we can put millions of people to work in good jobs, in good quality jobs. So we, without question, need labor reforms, and significant labor reforms that make it much more flexible to actually hire labor. I do have some concern, though, about the sort of ad hoc and rather abrupt moves that have been made in both Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh over this last week. I feel that we need a convergence of labor policy in the country. We need to address, 80% plus of our labor is in the informal sector. They have no protection, and we have complete flexibility in hiring and firing for informal labor. Less than 20% is formal labor, where there is almost complete protection and almost no flexibility in hiring and firing. And there needs to be a convergence over time. And I think if we should use the current crisis as a way of bringing about that convergence, where we have enhanced flexibility for formal labor, and we have enhanced protection for the informal sector, such that we can bring about a convergence between the two. So I would like to see that kind of direction. You won't get there in one step, but I would like to see that kind of direction. How do we enhance protection for informal labor? How do we increase flexibility for formal labor? And step by step, maybe even have a roadmap where we converge over time for one integrated labor market.
Okay, good. There are quite a few questions that have already come, and Dr. Kumar, I had this question for you, but I find that a lot of people who are asking similar questions, and let me put them up together. And the question that has come from many of our participants on the webinar is that how do you see the role of RCEP in a post-COVID world? That is one. And then there is one question that has come which says that to what extent is our lack of progress on FTAs have been due to our half-hearted approach to the idea of FTAs? And the third point is that is Indian agriculture been a problem in concluding these FTAs, in a sense that we have been unduly worried about Indian agriculture, and that has actually prevented us from going ahead with some of these FTAs, particularly the FTA with EU, whereas Vietnam has gone ahead because they were very clear in their mind on these issues. So would you like to respond to both the RCEP, the half-heartedness, and whether Indian agriculture is an issue? Because we have seen even in RCEP, Indian agriculture came up, FTAs, so maybe you should respond to that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Before I do that, I want to agree entirely with Honorable Suresh Prabhu, and I'm grateful, sir, that you pointed out Africa. And if I may suggest an out-of-box idea for the government, the Africans have got their act together and they've launched an Africa Free Trade Union, which I thought would never happen. But it's been a fantastic effort on the part of Africa. I think it would be in our fundamental interest to begin negotiations with Africa. And I think Africa will be more inclined at this point of time for an FTA with India rather than China and other countries, because we are not seen as predatory. We are seen as a country which can give something and take something. And I think there is a balance that you will see. So I'm very grateful to Honorable Suresh Prabhu for pointing out the importance of Africa. And you are right, sir, that skipped everybody's attention. So I'm grateful. Mr. Forbes, I totally agree with you that managed trade poses problems for India. But I'm afraid the era of a transparent MFN-based WTO is clearly over, but I hope I'm wrong. But otherwise, I'm fully in agreement with you. I just wanted to be clear. On the specific questions, AKB, that you posed to me, on RCEP, my understanding, we have the guru sitting in front of us, Honorable Suresh Prabhu, he will correct us. There were 3 categories of reasons why we were not able to sign to the RCEP. One was the China factor. The second really had to do with the non-tariff barriers and services exports to ASEAN and other countries where we did not get satisfaction. Third, domestic lobbies. When I say domestic lobbies, I say so without any pejorative connotation. I mean, if there is a milk producer who's genuinely scared of competition with New Zealand milk powder, I personally think that's not true. But if that is the worry, then there is nothing you can do about it. So is the case for several other important categories. So if these three things don't change, one is domestic, the other is external, two factors. There is one, the China factor, where we wanted a differential tariff with China. That is, we will not have the same degree of opening vis-a-vis ASEAN and vis-a-vis China. With China, we will obviously have much less tariff coverage as opposed to ASEAN. Second, I think the ASEAN countries must understand that you cannot give me a tariff concession in pharmaceutical products and then take 6 months to approve a pharmaceutical product to gain entry into the ASEAN market, because you are completely nullifying the tariff benefit that is granted to me. So we will have to again get some satisfaction from ASEAN and others, China also, on pharmaceutical products. What about visas for our IT professionals, mode 4 of services and mode 1 of services? Unless these things happen, I do not see how we can go back. But finally, and this Mr. Forbes will be able to answer better. I loved Mr. Forbes' letter that he wrote in a paper, I can't remember where now, where you argued that Indian industry must face up to competition. I've kept it somewhere. And thank you very much as former CII chairman to be able to say that. I think the Indian industry, we will have to take a call. I mean, this is not the time, because post-corona, everybody is weak. But in a year's time, you will have to read the riot act to the Indian industry and say, listen, perform or perish, because we have given you a long rope. And obviously, we will have to carve out some sectors. If there are some sectors where there is mass employment, I would carve it out. I will now come to agriculture, which was the question you posed. Yeah. Agriculture is one issue I have felt is a red line that no government in India can afford to cross, because it is a red line, whether we like it or not. One of the biggest challenges we are going to face is our trade deal with the United States, because the United States believes that agriculture is like selling watches and selling shoes and selling shirts. It's not. With EU, we will not have this problem, because EU itself protects agriculture. So I don't think they can actually tell us that you please open up the market on agriculture, which is why I like the EU-Vietnam model. I think we can get away with that. But with the United States, I agree with you, there will be a problem. On agriculture, however, my submission is the public distribution system, the minimum selling price model, and the fertilizer subsidies are crying out for reforms. This must be done in our own interest, frankly. And I think I point to writings of Ashok Gulati, whom everybody knows, but I mean, there are so many ideas on the table. But a bit like the labor reform, agriculture, if you touch it, then there is a hue and cry from opposition parties and everybody else saying, oh my God, you're killing the lives of farmers. We need to have a somewhat rational and sanitized debate on agriculture. I don't know if it's possible. Maybe a parliamentary committee can look at it, a bipartisan, all-partisan committee, because we have allowed agriculture to actually become a victim of politics. And I don't like it, because, even now, a big proportion of employment depends on agriculture. But I would say if we can carry out the domestic reforms in agriculture, then I don't believe our major trading partners will make unreasonable demands on India. They recognize that we are a poor country, that 50% of employment is dependent on agriculture. And I don't think they will come and say, we want unlimited exports from America of wheat and rice to India. I don't think they are that naive. We can convince them. But the problem in agriculture, to the best of my knowledge, lies in the actions that we need to take domestically to reform the PDS system, to reform the minimum sales price, and reform the fertilizer sector. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mr. Prabhu. There are some questions that have come which broadly suggest and They want to know, of late, many developed countries have begun adopting protectionist policies, raising tariffs. In such a situation, what should be India's approach? That's number one. Number two, post-Brexit, how do you think we should look at UK as a market? And are there opportunities that need to be tapped? And finally, this is my question. If Dr. Kumar says that agriculture is a red zone, is there some way at a political level we need to do something by which the level of discussion on agriculture is better informed by larger issues of complete lack of investment in agriculture, which has made Indian agriculture most uncompetitive and most unproductive, as a result of which this demand for more protection keeps coming. So is there a larger politico-economic issue that lies ahead of India's agriculture, because it is linked to our greater engagement with the world on a trading formats? So Mr. Prabhu, your responses.
For me?
Yes, for you.
Okay. You see, first, let me start with this very interesting question on agriculture. We have a mission set by Prime Minister Modi, doubling farmers' income. If you want to double farmers' income, there's always a paradox. When you have more production, the prices fall. So unless we can export that surplus production and take it out of domestic market, the farmers will never get a due price. And to do that, in fact, the first time I was lucky to present first ever India's agriculture export policy with a clear target of $100 billion of export. And when it's agriculture, it includes 5 components: agriculture, horticulture, dairy, marine products, and meat. All 5 put together, we have a great opportunity. And now, in fact, again, the renewed focus the world is going to be on public health, but also on food. Because when we talk about value chain and supply chains, we were only thinking about value chain and supply chain for merchandise and manufactured products. But a value chain for food is going to be very important, particularly for those countries who are deficient in food production. And therefore, I think we can really benefit from it immensely. And to do that, I fully agree, we'll have to relook into some of the domestic policy, which actually there's a lot of work which is going on. I just spoke about it in rejuvenation of India's agriculture only recently. And I spoke about it to, of course, FICCI, the other Chamber of Commerce, only recently. Okay, that is one part. The second part is on Brexit. I remember as Commerce Minister, I used to have a discussion with the Trade Minister of UK. I was only telling him that till you are married and not formally divorced, we cannot have another marriage with us. So we have to obviously discuss about Brexit in reality, and that particular time, it was always a lottery, whether Brexit will happen, not happen, how will it happen, all those questions. But UK, almost the same size of India's economy. And therefore, we must really work with UK post Brexit and make the agreement with them. They will obviously be interested to do agreement with US first. The UK's priority of agreement with US and then the rest of EU after their exit. But India would be bravely should be interested to talk to them. We have had initial discussion. But I think this is an opportunity for India as well as for UK, both. It is both. Incidentally, the inward investment into UK by India was more than the UK's investment to India at one given point of time. So that's a changing paradigm between UK-India relationship, including Tata's made investment in UK. There is recently the TVS bought a company during the COVID time, a motorcycle company in UK. So we are making investments into UK as well. So I think post-Brexit, India would be certainly be a good market. I think broadly, I fully agree let us look at it. How do you look at, because what has happened now next 5 years.
Okay.
I think this is a very, very good opportunity for India. And for that, I again say the same thing, that we cannot have just looking at opportunities outside India, because what happens outside India will have a relationship with how do you plan in India to begin with? So I think we must prepare a proper roadmap for not 5 years, but for 10 years, and to take advantage of it. Because when the markets will start picking up, they are going down today, and we don't know how the corona is going to behave in the next few years' time, whether it comes back again, for what time the vaccine will be developed. All those are the question marks. But world economy will one day or other will recover. If not 5 years, for sure, in the next 10 years, we'll have a upswing again. At that time, to benefit from it, we must have a strategy fully ready today, wherein we can take advantage of tomorrow's emerging opportunities. I agree that industry also has to rethink about their own strategies. In fact, NAUSHAD will tell you, and he was also a very principal partner in that. We prepared in this $5 trillion economy with CI and their top membership who actually manufacture on their hands-on experience in manufacturing, a strategy as to how $1 trillion of that 5 trillion, which is taking today's contribution of industry to GDP is about 16%, to take it to 20%, that will be $1 trillion in the proposed $5 trillion economy. How could it be that industry can benefit from it? And then we worked on what is that industry need to do to actually make it happen. So one key element has to be competition. In power sector reforms, which when I did it, everybody was angry with me, but then we got $250 billion of investment into upstream, that is generation. Thanks to we got competition. Even in generation, we got competition. Otherwise, there was a state monopoly. So if we got competition, it got investment. The same thing we are trying to do in distribution, which unfortunately, despite the fact that it was there in Electricity Act, the subsequent UPA government did not pursue it. In fact, they amended the law and removed the clause of cross-subsidization of what we wanted. In distribution, industry pays more than the other sectors. And that is making India's industry uncompetitive. So making competition, not just on power sector, but generally, has to be the guiding principle, which will bring in the best in you, which will help you to compete globally. Because when you go in competition globally, who's going to give the protection, like what Ambassador has been repeatedly saying about MFN? Are they going to protect us as their son-in-laws when you go to the global market? We'll have to focus on competition, global competition, not only from their domestic players, but from global players. Because Germans will come and compete in, say, Africa, or China will go and compete in Africa. Unless we are competitive, and competitiveness will come from competition. Competitiveness, we always talk about. But where is this word competitiveness comes from? How do you get that competitiveness? Competitiveness will come from competition. So we'll have to do that. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. I think this session could have gone on for at least another hour with such eminent experts addressing these questions, so well. And we haven't touched upon many of the questions, but we are running out of time. We were to close at 12:45. We are only at 12:44. And it's also a difficult task for a moderator to sum up the discussion, serious discussion. But let me try to summarize the key 5 takeaways from my perspective and share it with this audience. Number one, I think the new takeaways, we know you all talked about many things, but the new takeaways are the need to look at Africa. The need to look at Africa as the new focus area is something that is clearly underlined from a 5-year perspective. The number 2 is it is important to recognize that the time for dealing with strategic trade has come, because as Dr. Kumar said, the MFN trade has gone away, but it has brought in its wake a new strategic trade. There are worrying trends in the strategic trade, managed trade, as Dr. Forbes pointed out, but I think this is a reality that we need to confront with. Along with that is the need for competition that Mr. Prabhu so clearly pointed out. So you have Africa, you have got strategic trade, you have competition. The third point I would say is this, that if you want to stay alive in the global trading markets, we need to focus on bringing investments into this country. That's very, very important, critical. And number 4, I would say, and I'm trying to paraphrase a beautiful statement that Dr. Forbes made, that you must force industry to accept change and reform. And I think that's a very important message coming from an industry leader, and I hope people in the government are listening to him. And the fifth point is on agriculture, wherein a person with vast experience in dealing with trade negotiations is saying that there's need to rethink on what we need to do about domestic agricultural policies and how to make them more competitive. I thought these were the 5 broad messages that I got from this session, and going forward, 5 years of trade battle, so to say, we have to deal with. Let us close this session on this note, hopeful note that we will overcome one day. Thank you very much to all the webinar participants, Mr. Prabhu, Dr. Forbes, Dr. Kumar, being part of very, very patient and as well as very, very insightful comments. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you all.
All the best.
Thanks. Is everything off now? No.